Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Paul Golan. I'm Executive Director of the Society for Humanistic Judaism. Thank you for joining us. This is a program that is a release party for our summer issue of Humanistic Judaism Magazine. Hopefully, everyone here has heard of that. Maybe you all already receive it. If you don't, check out our website at shj.org, and there's a little paper airplane icon at the top of it. You can get on our email list and preview the magazines whenever they come out, and hopefully at some point subscribe if you'd like. A subscription to Humanistic Judaism Magazine, besides entitling you to the magazine, is actually a tax deduction because it is supporting Humanistic Judaism. SHJ is a nonprofit organization, and until we're told otherwise by the government, we are able to write those donations to charities off from our taxes. And that's not the main reason why you might want to give, but it may be incentive for you. But the reason why I hope you would give is
Couldn't
because
hide.
Hmm?
You couldn't hide.
It couldn't hurt. And hopefully you find some meaning and enjoyment and community through humanistic Judaism. So I am going to turn things over to the editor of Humanistic Judaism Magazine, who is Cantor Jonathan Friedmann, and he's gonna lead us in today's program. Take it away, Jonathan.
You're muted,
You're on
John.
mute.
I muted myself. So yeah, thank you, Paul. This is a wonderful opportunity to explore Jews in comics. It's a subject that's a passion for some of us and will perhaps become a passion for you too by the end of the evening. First, I'm going to introduce our guests today, and then we're going to look at the magazine itself. I'll just give sort of an overview of what is in there if you haven't had a chance to look at it yet. I'm pretty excited about this particular issue. And then we're going to watch a short documentary film, and then that will be followed by Q&A. So we are joined by co-curators of JewCE, the Jewish Comics Experience, Danny Fingeroth and Roy Schwartz. Danny is a biographer, cultural historian, and former writer and editor at Marvel Comics, whose latest book is Jack Ruby, The Many Faces of Oswald's Assassin. He also authored A Marvelous Life, The Amazing Story of Stan Lee, Disguised as Clark Kent, Jews, Comics, and the Creation of the Superhero, and Superman on the Couch, What Superheroes Really Tell Us About Ourselves and Our Society. Roy Schwartz is a pop culture and comic book historian, former CNN regular contributor, board member of the American Jewish Historical Society, and author of Is Superman Circumcised? The Complete Jewish History of the World's Greatest Hero. And his favorite comic book character, I just learned, is actually Captain America. So, like I said, I'm going to take us through the magazine a little bit. Just a quote from the intro, something that I've discovered in my time researching the subject. It really is no exaggeration to say that Jewish creators and entrepreneurs, almost all of whom were secular in outlook, invented the comic book industry in America. Jews introduced the first standalone comic book, the first superhero, the first comic book convention, the first comic book store, and the first graphic novel, and I'm sure the first other things as well. So in our issue for the summer, first of all, what a wonderful cover. I know you're all thinking. The inside of both the front and back cover, you'll find some provocative and fascinating and beautiful work by Eli Valley, who's also interviewed in the issue. He's a contemporary satirical political cartoonist with quite a lot to say. We'll start things in the issue off with a list of 5 must-read Jewish graphic novels compiled by Rabbi Mary Raskin, followed by Rabbi Jeffrey Falick's really wonderful overview of how Jews shaped the comics industry in the US. After that, we have a wonderful look at what is truly a delightful graphic novel by cartoonist Eric Lichtman, Camp Pocklwacknie in the Dynamite Summer of '77, all about his experiences at Jewish summer camp. And after that, we have a historian and curator of EC Comics, a very important company from the 1950s, Robert L. Reiner, talking about not only the impact that this company had at that time, but also the lasting impact. They brought us Mad Comics, which became Mad Magazine, Tales from the Crypt, a whole bunch of crime and horror and science fiction comics that continue to influence creators to this day, including Ali Valley, who I mentioned earlier. In my interview with him, he mentions the great influence that Mad Magazine had on his cartooning. And we have a couple of his political cartoons included there. Very provocative stuff. That is followed by Jeff Treisman, who is a leader in the Humanistic Jewish movement, telling about the origins of his project, which is the Jewish Comics Library of Seattle, something that he has put together as a former school librarian, and something that I wish I had in my area, and I think I need to go to Seattle just to see what he's got. That will be followed by what we're really here to watch together, the Jewish Comics Experience documentary, which Roy writes about in his piece, the background, how that whole project got started. And like I said, we'll see the documentary in just a little bit. Then we have a review by co-creator of JewCE, the Jewish Comics Experience, Miriam Eve Mora, reviewing The Holy Roller. It's a new comic book series that recently was collected as a trade paperback that explores the secular awakening of a secular Jewish awakening of a vigilante who defends his town against a neo-Nazi gang. Can't hear me? Sorry. Everything's okay? Okay, so that is followed by David Greenfield, a comics educator, talking about the wide world of Jewish graphic novels. And lastly, our very own Paul Golan discusses a rather serious topic, which is the banning of mouse and other graphic novels, and what that tells us about the rise of white Christian nationalism in the US. Very relevant material there. So that's what you'll find in the magazine itself. And at this time, I want to share the documentary, which kind of says it all. One of the reasons why I'm keeping my comments brief is that I think by the time you're done watching this 20-minute documentary, you will know really what you need to know to get started, at least in exploring the Jewish role in creating and continuing and shaping not only the comic book industry, but really American popular culture as we know it. So without further ado, let me try to share my screen. All right, hopefully you can see this, and hopefully you'll be able to hear it as well.
Superman is a Jewish character.
Spider-Man is a covertly Jewish character.
According to Marvel Comics, the Thing is Jewish.
The truth is that the vast majority of superheroes were created or co-created by Jews.
All right, well, wonderful documentary. I think we will all agree. What we're going to do now is just a Q&A. I'll start things off with some softball questions.
I just want to say that
sure, you'll start things off. Go ahead.
I am amusing, as you know. I feel like that movie has set a high standard for what the answers to your questions are going to be, because the movie took out, like, if the movie took like 10% of the footage of me, which means the other 90% are just like stupid babbling stuff. So right away, I just want to say I am not as I cannot possibly be as intelligent as I sounded in that movie because of the gifted editing of the filmmakers. So that's just a caveat up front. I want to warn people.
Yeah, I've interviewed you before, and I only partially agree with that. So what we'll do, though, like I said, we'll do the Q&A. I'll start things off. I don't know, Paul, how we want to handle audience Q&A. Maybe with the hand raising, that sort of thing.
Sure, or they can ask a question in the chat.
Okay, so we'll get to that. But again, just some softball questions to get things rolling. Danny, so you are among the Jewish contributors to the comic book industry. You had a long and illustrious career at Marvel Comics as an editor and a writer. Did you always kind of know that you were in a Jewish industry when you were there, or was this something that developed over time?
I knew I was in an industry that had a lot of Jews working in it. So I don't know if my sense of the history was that comprehensive that I thought of it. Say, I started working there at Marvel. I was a comic fan from the time I was a child, but I wasn't particularly involved in capital F fandom. And I came to work at Marvel in 1977. My first boss was Larry Lieber, Stan Lee's kid brother. So Larry's now only 93. And I'll talk some more about him if we get a chance. But so I knew that, there were a lot of people with Jewish names, but I didn't have a quite yet sense, I don't think, of comics the way you would think about the movie industry, you know. But it wasn't long before I kind of, figured it out. Um, and I guess certainly the thing that had opened the door to that interpretation of comics industry history was really Jules Feiffer's The Great Comic Book Heroes, which was a groundbreaking landmark book in so many ways. It was, I was 12 when it came out, and it was the only thing I wanted for Hanukkah that year. I mean, for comic fans, that was the holiday gift of 1965. And I think Pfeiffer, talked about the implicit Jewishness of Superman, but really he dwelled more on the spirit because he had worked as Eisner's assistant and co-creator on the spirit for years, and so he was more able to see the Jewish aspect of the spirit in part because he helped put it there, But maybe that was the introduction. To anybody thinking that about the characters. I didn't think that much about the backgrounds of the creators till I literally was in the office, and then I went, "Oh, there's seems to be a lot of Jews here." Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. Hey, Roy, I know you've devoted a lot of time and energy to exploring intersections of Jews and superheroes specifically. What is it about people in spandex punching each other, as Danny said, that intrigues you so much?
Well, when you put it that way, Jonathan, well, I mean, that's the million shekel question, right? Why Jews in comics? Why Jews in superheroes? Um, could anybody else at a different place and different point in history invent the same medium and the same genre? I don't know. Yeah, how about Hollywood? How about Broadway, for that matter? I don't think it's about the guys punching each other, although if we wanted to really get nuance, it's this kind of Greco-Roman shell into which we put Jewish values. The idea of you can say, okay, the Flash is Mercury and Superman is Apollo, and that's fine and that's true. But the values are Judeo-Christian values. They're humanistic values that Judaism brought to the ancient world. The idea of social justice in that sense, the idea of the servant leader, the idea of a hero who's not questing for glory or immortality or godhood, but to protect the community and protect the weak and the innocent. That is a Jewish concept. That is something that Judaism as a social movement brought to the world at that point in time. And that's really the sort of thematic roots that superheroes come from, with all the accoutrement of Greco-Roman muscularity, which of course has a lot of echoes in the time of rising Nazism in the 30s and 40s. Um, in my own sense, I just connected with it. I connected with the Christopher Reeve movies. I connected with the medium as a medium. Um, and when my 5 and 6 and 8-year-old friends kind of moved on to sports and girls, well, that interested me as well. I stuck with comics also, and that's really never left me. I'm still there, and I'm enjoying every minute of it.
Yeah, I think the popularity of superhero movies maybe has given some credibility to adult comic book fans that maybe didn't exist at certain times.
I think if you went back in time and told Danny and me in, let's say, 1992, that one day there'll be an Avengers movie, but not just that, there'll be a sequel and a third and a fourth. And in the fourth one, Spider-Man will swing off Thor's hammer to get the Infinity Gauntlet away from Thanos. And that movie will make $2.8 billion. We would just think you're screwing with us, right? There's no way you'd believe it, and here we are. So we're living in a golden age.
Yeah. So we do have some questions in the chat box. Hopefully I'll get all of them. Rabbi Jody Cornfield says, what a wonderful documentary. Are there any plans for a traveling exhibit coming to Chicago?
So the exhibit is traveling. It went to DC and to Hong Kong, I think Seattle, and it's opening in Cleveland next summer. I'm actually going to be there tomorrow to help plan it, so it's coming. And if you build it, we will come. So Rabbi Kornfeld, if there's an opportunity there and you'd like to connect us, we can connect you with the Center for Jewish History, which produced and owns the exhibit. We were the hired hands who curated it, and we can arrange for that. Aside from that, a documentary is also screening around. Actually, Danny and I and Dr. Mora will be at Lincoln Center on September 29th. It's screening.
Oh, it's amazing.
Or as part of the Cavalier and Clay Opera.
Yeah.
It's connected with that. The exhibition, it's kind of a mix and match. It's really 5 mini exhibitions. And you can, I mean, if you have the space and the depth of interest, we certainly would be thrilled to have people, rent or license, whatever you want to call it, all 5. But the mixing and matching can happen too, But the full juice experience is those 5 mini exhibitions. So I would urge people to try to see it that way.
Great. Yeah, we had another question about the traveling stuff. So thank you for that. Let's see. Are there any openly Jewish characters in current superhero comic books? The only Jewish character I know in the Marvel universe is Magneto. Of course, there are a few others, but I think the question is about openly Jewish now that we're in the multicultural phase of comic book entertainment. Any sort of updates on representation?
Well, the Thing is the main character, up to and including the movie, up to and including, having Natasha Lyonne as his girlfriend. How much more Jewish do you get than that? Yeah, there's a half dozen. Roy, the Thing, of course, the first one that comes to mind. Roy, who else do we have?
No, the Thing is very clearly Jewish. He visits a synagogue in the new movie.
Yeah.
Nasha's in black and white cookies and, all that stuff. Moon Knight in his explicitly Jewish in the comics and to a lesser extent in the Marvel show. Kitty Pryde from the X-Men is Jewish in the comics and not so much in the movies, and we'll see what the future brings. In the comics, Green Lantern is Hal Jordan, that is paternally Jewish. And believe it or not, they've been hinting heavily that Bruce Wayne's mother, Martha Kane, was Jewish. And therefore he is also halachically Jewish. But that's been heavily hinted and not explicitly confirmed. But on screen, a lot of these Jewish characters have been whitewashed. So in terms of Jonathan, multiculturalism that you mentioned, they've actually taken our group backwards. And of the Jews you do see, they're almost virtually all Ashkenazi. There's very little beyond that. People don't know that Zoe Kravitz, who plays Catwoman, and is black is 100% Jewish, for example. It would fry circuits if they knew, because Jews are not conceived in that way.
Yeah, I think
And what about
part of what
Sabra?
you're,
Yeah,
go ahead.
there was the whole Sabra controversy. Was
Yeah,
there
I've
being
written about it.
Israeli and/or Jewish in the movie, in the Captain America movie?
I mean, she's Israeli and she has an accent. And if you're Israeli, you're 75% likely to be Jewish, but they
Right,
don't call her Sabra just by her name, Ruth
right.
Bat Seraph, which is a very Hebraic name. Um,
I hear there's going to be a
this-
panel about this at the New York Comic Con.
it just so happens. Look at
Just
Danny.
happens
He's being Stan Lee. You gotta come. True believers. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
I
we're
think
gonna have a panel about that, as well as about Superman's Judaism. It's gonna be a simcha, as Danny says. You should show up. Yeah.
yeah. I think part of what you're alluding to is how most people receive at least superhero comics these days is through the film medium and television and that sort of thing, which I think is maybe a safer venue in terms of going to more interesting ethnic corners. Certainly in graphic novels and that whole other world of comic bookdom, there's a lot more going on with Jewish representation.
Jonathan, it's
Yeah.
very interesting what you just said.
Okay, thank
You
you.
said the way most people get superhero comics is through the movies, which
Yes.
is a contradiction. I mean, I know everybody knows what you meant is the way people get superhero stories, but the reason I jump on that is not merely because I'm a nitpicky editorial type, but because sometimes when I teach or lecture, I will say to people of all ages, "Hey, do you guys read comics?" And they say yes. And I go, "How many of you actually read physical comics?" And then maybe a quarter. When people somehow equate going to a superhero movie with reading comics, it's a really interesting phenomenon. That even someone as well informed and well read and versed in this stuff as you said it, and I think it's a interesting crossover and overlap between these media.
Yeah, well, I didn't say it sort of tongue in cheek or anything like that. Basically, we've had a long history of books being adapted to film, and that's how many of us have read Moby Dick, for instance, right? So that's not so unusual. But I do think that, at least you can correct me, most of the comic book stories that we see on the screen, whether people realize it or not, are drawn from comic books themselves, right? So you mentioned the Infinity Gauntlet and stuff like that.
I mean, it's worth mentioning, and Danny just touched on that, is that, in case you guys in the audience don't know, comic books are a medium, the same as cinema or theater or novel, and superheroes are a genre. And yes, it's the proprietary genre of the medium of comics, but that genre can exist in everything from a movie to a TV show to an opera, as we're having at the Met now, to a video game. So those are not jointly exhaustive things. They're exclusive of each other.
And
But most people know superheroes from movies and shows, for better or worse. Yeah.
but some of the things that we think of as inherent to superhero mythology, including say kryptonite, actually started. And I may be wrong about kryptonite in particular, but a lot of the things started in radio, in movies, in TV, and then because so many more people watch the movies than read even the most popular superhero comics, a lot of it is retrofitted back into the comics. So there's a constant back and forth between the media. But if something sticks and is very popular in a movie, I mean, a very successful superhero comic will sell maybe 500,000 copies, and maybe with passing along audience, you figure maybe if you're lucky, then 2 million people have read it. Well, if a big Hollywood movie is only seen by 2 million people, that's considered an enormous failure, So the number of people who are more familiar with them through the movies, TV shows, and even video games, or especially video games, dwarfs comic book readership.
Yeah, wasn't Jimmy Olsen introduced in the television show, the George Reeves show, and then brought into the comics? Maybe not, but
Radio show.
What's that?
Radio show.
Radio show.
And
Got it.
Danny's right about the kryptonite. Although that is an interesting history where it was introduced in the comics in a comic book that was kiboshed by the editors, and then the idea was pulled into the radio, proved successful, and brought back into the comic, this kind of mimetic cycle. But Superman is a great example because he's the oldest. He's been around the longest, and that rich mythology is cross-pollinated between mediums, endlessly.
Yeah, interesting. So hopefully we have some other questions from our audience. Again, you can put in the chat or raise your hand, or we can just keep talking.
I'll jump
Yeah,
in with a
Paul.
question.
Yeah.
Obviously, and someone commented, this short film squeezed a lot of history together.
Yes.
So there was one piece where it kind of jump cut in a way that left me confused. So I'm hoping you can clear this up. So I know it didn't actually mention the comic book code, I don't think. It mentioned what led up to having the comic book code, but then you and then it jumps to Marvel and it's early 1960 explosion of heroes in order and it's you said in order to grab some of the success of DC's superheroes, but my understanding from the film before that was that superheroes had been on the decline, and then the comic book code happened. Is that what revived superheroes? Was that the true crime stuff kind of got censored in a way that revived? Or did DC do something that made the superheroes come back again in the late 50s? Well, there was a piece of history there that's missing that I'm wondering if you can fill a little bit of that in.
Roy, can you take that? I got to get a glass of water.
I was about to say Danny is the rabbi on this one. Sei gesund, Danny. That's a good question. The movie is fast-paced. At the end of the day, we had to choose who's the target audience, and we wanted to be appealing to a younger audience. And their attention spans are quick and short. But there is honestly enough stories without filler and without stretching it. There are enough engaging stories for this to be a 4-hour series, which is what we hope to expand it to one day. It actually came very close at some point, so we're hoping to get back there. Um, it's a good question. It's a complicated answer. We do mention the Comic Code Authority. It was this self-censoring body that really was very stringent and sort of lobotomized superheroes in comics for decades and gave them a stigma that's lingering to this day. But a group of clever editors, particularly one called Julius Schwartz, no relation to me. Danny, I think you met him, right?
I met you. I knew him a little bit,
He probably gets the main credit here for sort of jump starting, sparking the.
You would, yeah. I mean, it's when we look back on history, we telescope these things and compress them because they ran out of they couldn't do crime anymore. The Comics Code, as you said, kind of by its nature made things sort of bland, but it also required artists and writers to be inventive and clever. So Julie had been the editor of a lot of the superhero comics of the 40s, and because it came in a comic called Showcase, which is what it sounded like. So one issue was about firemen, one issue was about some other kind of heroic fiction, and so the Flash came out as in Showcase number 4 in 1956, but it was months before he appeared again, and then it was years before Green Lantern. Now, Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, for different reasons, never stopped being published. So there were at least those kind of superheroes on the stands at all times, and occasionally, the company that publishes Archie would throw some superheroes against there was always somebody trying some kind of superhero thing, but it wasn't until the mid and then the late 50s that DC made them brought back modernized versions of characters from the so-called Golden Age, the Flash, Green Lantern. Then they put them together in a team called the Justice League, and that also was very popular. And that, depending on which mythology you want to believe, one way or another led to the Fantastic Four coming out. I found one interesting omission, and unless I missed it, there was no mention that Wortham himself was Jewish, which I thought was an important. Is it mentioned, Roy? You're muted. Roy, you're still mute. You're muted. I can't hear you. You're muted. You're muted. You're muted. You're muted.
Oh yeah, I didn't mute myself. Somebody muted me. I blame Paul. No,
Wasn't
uh
me.
yeah, no, we do mention
In the
and you're right, it's
movie?
fast paced, you can easily miss parts, but we do, which means you gotta watch it again, guys. But we do, he was a educated, genteel German Jew, who was also he was a social crusader, but he was also kind of a prig, and he borrowed his authority as a psychiatrist to kind of crusade against what he thought was in bad taste. That's sort of
Oh,
the short version of it. And here was a Jew, a few years after the Holocaust, calling other Jews worse than Nazis in court. So
well,
it was quite a dramatic story.
he was highly progressive as opposed to a lot of the others. Most of the enemies, most of the people who were opposed to comics or thought they were too violent or wanted to ban them came from very conservative political and Christian religious uh,
Nationalists, yeah.
backgrounds. Wortham was very progressive, left-wing guy, and he was not a refugee. He came to America as part of his psychiatric career, and then he realized maybe the early 1930s, maybe it's not such a good time to go back to Germany or Austria. Was he German or Austrian?
German.
Um,
Yeah, German. So
Germany.
but he had a very um, but there's a sort of metaphor system where you can look at Wortham as representing the more assimilated, more financially successful Jewish immigrants in America who sort of could take a condescending attitude towards the poorer Eastern European Jews are looked down on as not being as cultured or refined or intelligent. So it was, there's in some way that is at work there, along with the coded anti-Semitism, that quote about definitely gold-plated sewers of New York or something, that was, some things never change, be referring to something
Yeah, yeah.
from New York, is referring to it as being Jewish.
Yeah, Catholic World, which was a magazine back then, wrote about the rats of New York. There was a lot of that kind of euphemistic language.
Yeah, thank you. Other questions? Okay, so there is one about whether or not Star Trek and or Star Wars fit into the comics tradition, while
Oh
not
yeah.
having been in, well, there are many comic book adaptations as well, but just in the broader sense of sort of sci-fi fantasy comics, how does maybe something like Star Trek and Star Wars fit into that?
Well, if we want to go into this, and this Danny can speak about with more authority, in 1975, the Star Wars comic book saved Marvel, arguably the whole comic book industry. Um, so there's definitely been a very strong print synergy, symbiosis with these properties. Um,
What Roy means is Marvel's adaptation of the movie into comic book form,
right,
which actually came out. The first
before.
3 issues of the comic came out before the movie debuted. So it was a synergistic thing, but it was very beneficial to Marvel. You really have to give Roy Thomas a lot of credit for seeing the potential. He really had to convince Stan Lee, who was the publisher at that point, that it was worth doing. Because Marvel did a lot of movie adaptations. A lot of them went nowhere, especially because they had to pay a licensing fee. But this, of course, worked out um, pretty terrifically. But the other, I mean, you don't have to be a comic book scholar to draw a line from Doctor Doom to Darth Vader. I mean, it's a pretty clear. I mean, I would say when I first saw the first Star Wars, what I said to myself, as many people did, oh, they finally put something with a Marvel comic look and feel on screen, something that was not making fun of it, something that didn't wink and say to the audience, well, we know this is stupid stuff, but you're here with your kids, so just grin and bear it because your kid's going to enjoy. This is the first one that say unlike the Batman 60s TV show, which I loved. I was 12, 13 years old. For all its flaws, it did its job. Um, but Star Wars was like a Marvel comic in disguise, the way a lot of people saw it.
Yeah, apparently Jack Kirby, co-creator of the Marvel Universe, felt very much that some of his ideas were taken by Star Wars, and I'm sure that was kind of partially true, partially the idea that Star Wars itself is built on archetypes, just like superheroes. So it's hard to say who created what at a certain point.
Well, we
Right.
know George Lucas was, he never credited comic books, but he was a comic book fan. He actually co-owned a comic book store before he made it as a director. And in 1970, Jack Kirby authored an opus called The Fourth World, also known as The New Gods. And a lot of those ideas,
Yeah.
and by the way, that was entirely a Jewish story, completely a Jewish story. It was
Oh my
basically
God,
Jews
yeah.
versus Nazis in space, all in metaphor. And a lot of those ideas ended up in Star Wars. So that DNA you can find there, and I can go more and more into it. There's a few elements in Star Wars that can be traced back to Talmudic stories about Moses, if you really want to dig and argue if there's a, kind of archetypical Jungian kind of echo. But just for the fun of it, I'll say Star Trek. Everybody knows Mr. Spock, who is highly intelligent and evolved. And, he has the Vulcan salute, live long and prosper. Leonard Nimoy brought that to the role. It wasn't in the original script by Gene Roddenberry. This is the Hebrew letter Shin, like you have in your mezuzah. And Leonard Nimoy's grandfather was a chazan, was a cantor in a synagogue, and he would bring him, and the Cohens would do the blessing of the Cohens. And live long and prosper is a paraphrasing of what Moses tells the Israelites when he delivers them to Israel. So there's just for a fun little water cooler moment there.
By the way, just I'm not getting anything for this plug, but the latest episode of Mark Maron's WTF podcast is a great interview with Mark Hamill. I highly recommend it. And I'd say the most Jewish thing in it is Hamill's imitation of a filmmaker, Sam Fuller. It's near the beginning, so you got to catch it. But Sam Fuller, I'm sure many of you know the name, but I'm not sure if Sam Fuller was the Jack Kirby of movies or if Jack Kirby was the Sam Fuller of comics. But if you're looking for hints of Jewishness and just crazy, wild, inventive movies, the whole oeuvre of Sam Fuller. But this interview with Maron is really terrific.
Yeah, and Mark Hamill certainly is on record talking about his comic book fandom.
Oh yeah,
So, if we think of it in terms of the actors and what they brought to Star Wars, at least some of them were reading this stuff.
yeah. He mentions his comic book fandom. So it didn't sound like he kept up with it, but certainly at some point sounds like Hamill was a big comics fan.
Yeah. So, Danny, you mentioned something about Larry Lieber and that you might get back to it.
Oh well, Larry was my first boss, and he was so it's his fault that I worked in comics. He hired me. I like to say the important lesson I give to people looking for jobs in comics is when you go for your interview, make sure you have masking tape, not just on one side of your glasses, but on both sides of your glasses, because that's what I went in with, and I got the job. Um, Larry's a co-creator of Iron Man, Ant-Man, Thor, Groot. Drew the Spider-Man newspaper strip for over 30 years that written by his brother, with help from Roy Thomas and other people plotting it. But Larry, at age 93, has written his first prose novel, and it's called Chirps. And it's an action adventure story, probably YA. There were various reasons. Larry could have gotten it published. My agent could have helped him sell it to like a mainstream publisher, but Larry basically said, I'm 93, I'm not making any changes. This is the book. And it's a great book, but no editor is gonna or publisher is gonna say, oh, we'll take this here, we'll put in your contract, no change. So it's called Chirps. It's you can find it at chirpsbook.com or look up Larry Lieber. And if you liked his work at Marvel, this is an action adventure story, all prose. It's got a beautifully designed cover, and yeah, I mean, so it's an inspiration. A, that he's 93 and doing his first novel, and B, that he's 93 and doing his first novel, and possibly C, that he's 93 and doing his first novel, and it's great, and he's working on a next one. And it's and he started doing some convention touring too. Really, Larry was never one to seek the spotlight, so he doesn't generally do a lot of conventions, but he believes in this book and chirps so much that he's willing to go out to conventions and risk catching whatever convention crud is going around. um, but I just take it, take a look at the book. You can find it. It's on Amazon. It's on all the usual places. Everybody can order. You can order it directly, but the book is called Chirps, and he's done it as Lawrence Lieber, like Stan was saving Stanley Martin Lieber for the novel he never wrote. Larry has put this book out under Lawrence Lieber.
It's such an interesting thing to think about the dynamics between those two brothers. Stanley Lieber, who becomes Stan Lee in The Showman, and wears a toupee and all that stuff, and goes out of his way to hype everything that Marvel was doing, and then Larry keeping the Lieber name, working behind the scenes, as you're saying. Do you have any sense of their relationship as brothers?
It's complicated, is all I can say. I mean, one might say I've heard that in the Bible and even in Shakespeare, there are stories about brothers and the complicated nature of their relationship. So everything you just said, and yet Larry has this incredible body of work, um, and has never stopped. I mean, Stan's career was so unique. Both the circumstances he found himself in and the circumstances that he created for himself. I mean, I don't know if you noticed, but there's nobody at Marvel who has taken there's nobody in comics who has taken the closest you can say in comics all over, maybe Art Spiegelman, maybe Todd McFarlane, but there is nobody who, if you stopped the average person on the street and said, name one comics creator, it would be Stan Lee, and then they got nothing. So I mean, it's unfair to both of them to compare them like that. It's just, they were brothers, and like all brothers, they had a complicated relationship. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what other profound thing to say about it, but except buy the damn book.
No, it's interesting. I've always been interested in Larry Lieber as kind of the silent brother, in that regard.
Well, there
Yeah.
are, again, in conjunction with trying to get attention for Chirps, there are a number of interviews with Larry online, including one that I did for Ben Catcher's New York New York Comic Picture or Picture Comic Symposium. But there are several. Larry has done, there are 3 or 4 interviews. And what, you would not suspect he was 93. I mean, this level of what he remembers, the stories he tells are pretty remarkable for any age. But I can send you links to them, and you can send them out to people if you want. But he's definitely like I said, this chirp writing, and I my promise to Larry, I said, I am not a book publisher. I'm just a guy, who's learning about self-publishing, learning as I earn, and helping you. I will promise you to put a hardcover copy of the book with a dust jacket in your hand. Beyond that, I'm learning, as we go along, just like you, about promoting it and distributing it, and because in a way, self-publishing a book, is not that expensive, and if you have somebody working with you, or how to do design and layout, you can come up with a pretty professional looking package, which we have. Of course, then it's getting the word out and getting people to buy it, and people who, I'm pretty sure would enjoy it. So that, that's why he's become available more and more. He's not flying to California. He's a New York guy, and he's 93, so he's not eager to get on an airplane. He's not, in that way he's not like Stan. I think Stan would get on an airplane. But he's doing online things, and if you'd be interested in having him as an interview subject, I bet we could twist his arm and get him to do it. He's as long as he gets somebody there working the Zoom for him, he he will do it.
Understood. Yeah. Well, I do see a hand has been raised. So Eva, thank you.
Myself. Okay. When the film showed that gentleman, he wasn't so gentle, who was the social worker or the therapist, and he said that these comics and all that cause these diseases. My first response was, that's ridiculous. But when I think about it and I see so many violent movies where, here the hero very clearly was fighting for justice and for the people who needed protection. But in a lot of these films or books or comics, the killers or all that violence, I believe, does have an impact on the society and the readers. They come to see it as natural. Do you have an opinion on that?
Of course, it's a bunch of Jews. We have more opinions than people. But that's a great comment. And the thing to remember today, you mentioned movies, we have the MPA system, which is G, PG, PG-13, NC-17, etc. Or comics didn't have that back then. So any kid could walk up to a rack and buy something as innocent as Superman and as horrific as some sort of sadomasochistic body horror something. But the way they attacked comics and what Wortham was consistently making clear is that he was not in favor of censorship and he was not in favor of differentiating the different types of comics, but rather killing the industry altogether. He at some point said something along the lines of, the thing about a whorehouse is that you either close it or leave it open, not choose the whores, something to that extent. And he was not subtle in his allegories.
I never heard that quote from him, but okay.
Yeah, it's somewhere. I'll send it to you later. Something like that. The problem is very
Okay.
simple: either close on a brothel or not. Something along those lines. But that was the metaphor, and the so there was that issue. But the underlying logic, the main argument of Wortham, I read his book cover to cover, and I discuss it in my own book, and so does Danny. And his main argument is, since almost all of the juvenile delinquents, the violent juvenile delinquents that he treated as a psychiatrist, since most of them read comics, comics had to be a root cause of juvenile delinquency. Now that, of course, is idiotic logic. You could blame water or air. They all breathed air and drank water too.
Don't forget
That's
milk.
also a common denominator.
Don't
But
forget milk.
that really held sway, and people believed it, and it created hysteria across the nation.
Well, look, the glib answer, I mean, obviously it's a very complicated topic. The glib answer is that people, even before mass media, people somehow figured out how to kill and torture and hurt each other. So it's not like anybody needed an instruction manual. But there is, a thing that I wanted to find some way to shoehorn during this discussion in one way or another, and this question gives me as good an excuse as any, is that the fantasy of the superhero is not that they can fly, that they have X-ray vision, that they can lift a skyscraper. The fantasy is that they use fascistic tools for progressive ends. And if they don't, they're supervillains. But the idea of a mass superhero, and we're seeing a hint of that in our society now, with some guy in a mask coming along, or a bunch of guys in masks coming and grabbing defenseless people off the street with no explanation and no identification. That's a nightmare. The fantasy is that it's Clark Kent, or that it's Bruce Wayne, or that it's the Flash who's doing that, who is wielding this great power with, dare I say, great responsibility. But that's the powerful fantasy of the superhero. And this is something that I've wrestled with from day one in comics. I never read a comic book, that made me want to go punch somebody or beat somebody up or put them in a cage, but probably, and so what is the, this is the thing we wrestle with, believe it or not, at a company like Marvel all the time. What's our responsibility? What's too much? What's a quote unquote bad example? What's just quote unquote harmless entertainment? And maybe not everybody who ever does this work thinks about it. Maybe I'm a product of a certain kind of, background and education. But I just have to think, well, I never really thought that the solution to a problem was going and just punching somebody in the mouth. Although there are probably times I should have. But so, that to me it's an unanswerable question, except to really say, and not to sound like too much of a smart aleck, people did somehow know how to hurt and kill and torture each other well before there were mass media stories of costumed adventurers.
But can
I think
we create Marvel comics that show superheroes not with superpowers or magical powers, but ordinary people who do magnificent things? Can that not be incorporated into some of these stories? Because then there are heroes.
Well, I think they already are there. Have you have you read a Marvel comic ever?
I wouldn't say in the last 10 or 15 years, but in my youth, I read lots of comics.
Yeah.
Now I'm busy being a therapist and a rabbi, so I don't have a lot of time.
I do think there are, obviously, if you're wearing a red and blue costume, you're going to get more attention. But I do think the comics have always been filled with non-super beings who do positive things. Roy, you want to tell
Um,
you?
yeah, I think what Danny was talking about, that kind of tension between the use of violence as a solution and its meaning when it's for a good cause. The tension itself is sort of the secret sauce. It's the fuel of storytelling going all the way back to the Bible. I mean, the heroic figures of the Bible wrestle with these things as well, right? Power and responsibility in different variations. And this really ties into the Jewish origins of comics, because people with real power don't need to imagine superpowers, right? It came from that kind of need, from that kind of churning in the kishka to have the fantasy of power and being above it all, whether it's flying above it all or being impervious to harm or being able to overcome your adversary, whatever, what have you. And regarding the idea of regular people, whether it's police officers or firefighters or whatever, I do think the comics addresses that. But under that, with the exception of Superman, who sort of created all the tropes but also subverted them at the same time, so he's the alpha and omega of it. Most superheroes are really an everyman who gets one ability, one leg up, on other people, and then they use that to better the world around them. So I think that's very much at the core of the superhero fantasy and that again is a Jewish concept. It's not a demigod. It's not some monster of folklore. It's a shepherd. It's a David. It's a Moses. It's a humble person who's called for a task with some sort of ability. I think that's part of the DNA as well.
I noticed that you only mentioned male heroes.
Gets with the female. I'll say this. Wonder Woman, which is the one I know everybody knows, so it's easy to address. She is one of the few um, original comic book superheroes who were not created by Jews. And yet
But
her,
her editor was Jewish.
yeah, fair, and her publishers, right? And Yet her origin story, now they change it in the comics where she's the love child of Zeus and Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons, but originally was that she was sculpted out of clay and the Greek gods breathed life into her. That's the golem. She was very literally a golem. And then we have Gal Gadot, who played her in the movie. And if you saw the movie, and the first one is a good one, there's a scene in the boat where she and her soon-to-be boyfriend are talking, and the scene was very much ad-libbed. And Gadot is completely Israeli in that scene. It's just completely a reflection of Israeli culture in that one scene, which I thought was hilarious. Um, that's just to give an answer I know everybody can sort of latch
It's,
onto.
it's very much a male power fantasy. There are female superheroes, but we're talking about sort of historic. I think this particular conversation is taking a historical view. So there, a lot of the female superheroes of the 40s and 50s were kind of female counterparts. There was what Supergirl, there was Hawk, and
Mary
so
Marvel. Yeah.
Girl, so they were there. Well, just on my screen, Eva just went to the different side of the screen. But no, it's a perennial flaw and problem of the of the comics. They made a big thing, and I think correctly so, of the Black Widow in the Avengers movies and the Jean Grey, although there's the whole Jean Grey mythology and this sort of this female being overwhelmed by this evil entity within her is a whole other can of worms. It is a perennial
It
problem.
also has Jewish stuff in it as well. A
Right,
different conversation. Yeah.
right. It's a perennial, you know, a perennial issue. I gotta ask you, I got a funny name, so I can. How is going through life being named Goldfinger? What's that like? What do you get from people?
A lot of questions. One of the things I say to them is, if you don't believe me, I'll show you that.
Nice.
Not an appropriate thing to do for a rabbi, but I do a lot of inappropriate things.
Well, you're a rabbi and a psychiatrist?
She has her own James Bond theme
Therapist.
song also,
Therapist,
which I
yeah.
played when she was honored by our movement with the Sherwin T. Wine Award. So
Yeah.
That's
Before we get to you, Paul, I just want to draw attention to Jeff Treisman's comic. Again, he's the creator of the Jewish Comics Library of Seattle, just reminding us
Hi,
that
Jeff.
the world of comics is much broader than superheroes. We're talking about that now for obvious reasons, but if you want to find stories that maybe appeal to a broader audience and talk about different subjects and certainly have everyday people as the protagonists, graphic novels, certainly Japanese comics as well, which I know Paul wrote about. I mean, these are really what's making the money in print these days. Again, I think a lot of the interest in superheroes is now in the film world. We'll see how long that lasts. But in terms of where I think a lot of the energy is nowadays, at least my daughter will say, who reads this stuff a lot, is in the stuff beyond the superheroes.
Well,
I yeah.
I'll throw in one more plug, which is I work for the Will Eisner Studios and Foundation, and every year in March, around what would have been Eisner's birthday, we have something called Will Eisner Week, which is a series of events. We have over 100 events worldwide, in person, online. I guess those are the two main ways, in person or online. And it doesn't have to be about Will Eisner. It can be anything relating to comics, graphic novels, free speech. So you could probably find a Will Eisner event either near you or find one online, or you could even conduct your own if you wanted, and we will help promote it and send you posters and whatever else. You can go to willeisner.com to find out about that. But a lot of things flow from Eisner. A lot of what we think of as alternate comics and underground, well, maybe not undergrounds per se, but independent, alternate, non-superhero memoir comics, a lot of them flow from what Will Eisner did, not just in the 40s and 50s with The Spirit, but starting in 1978 with a graphic novel called A Contract with God, and like 20 more between that and when he passed away in 2005, working on his last graphic novel, which was an expose of the protocols of the Elders of Zion. So he has very Jewish content and very influential on people like Spiegelman and Picard and a million other brilliant cartoonists.
Yeah, and there's a new graphic biography of Will Eisner. I think very fitting to have, you know, the progenitor of graphic novels being, you know, his story being told in a graphic novel. It's pretty remarkable if you get a chance to check it out. It's by Stephen Weiner and Dan Mazur. I'm not sure if that's how to pronounce his name. Mazur.
I think Mazur would probably be the.
Yeah. Paul.
I'm just going to be mindful of time, but I was going to jump in with something similar to what Jeff wrote in the chat. I kind of jumped back into comic books very recently, and I've been pleasantly surprised to see many more women's names as illustrators and writers.
That's definitely true.
Yeah, you know, so and there's much greater diversity now, and the comics, certainly Marvel, and I think DC as well, have not only jumped in on, but absolutely doubled down, especially in today's environment, on LGBTQ inclusion with characters that are openly gay and bi and inclusive as far as across races. I mean, I'm old enough to remember like when a comic book superhero was black, he had the word black in front of his name, like what, and you know, it because it was so novel and new and somehow needed to be identified in words. Today, if you go peruse the comic book shop, it is really a wonderful, I think, mosaic. And it was leading to my question, which was the Jewish influence, you know, in an industry that was absolutely dominated by Jews at one point, in the same way that maybe Hollywood was at one point, and really no longer is anymore because it's gotten so big and inclusive and so on. Do you still see that Jewish influence kind of, did it rub off on lots of other people? I mean, I can think of a few people who were very important and not Jewish, like Neil Adams or Steranko, and also in the indie comics, like um, uh, Robert Crumb, who was married to a Jew but wasn't Jewish himself, but touches on a lot of Jewish themes in his work. You know, how has the fact that there were so many Jews in the comic industry kind of impacted on non-Jewish comic book writers and illustrators?
Wow, what a
Danny, you
question.
want to start off?
No, but I'll try. You know, well, I mean, comics was Jewish in the same way that a lot of New York-based businesses were Jewish, because before the internet, before Federal Express, before faxes, if you wanted to be in comics, like a lot of businesses, like finance, like the theater, you know, if you wanted to break into a business or even stay in a business, you had to be the person that could show up in an hour, right? Oh, can you be in an hour for a meeting? Can you draw that story in it overnight? Can, you know, so I think a lot of much of it had to do with it just being so New York centric and being so considered so illegitimate, a half step up, if that, from pornography. So it's like when it became a more legitimate and more accepted art form and medium, so a kid from Indiana could say to his parents, Mom, Dad, I'm going to New York to be in comics. And they wouldn't have heart attacks and die on the spot. They would go, well, you know, it would be like any other business that somebody moved to New York for. So, I mean, I think in terms of the content, right, everything we've talked about, you know, Superman is Jewish, Batman is, this is all stuff we're seeing in retrospect. The last thing that any comic creator in the 1940s, 30s, 40s, 50s wanted to do was to create a Jewish story, you know, or a story that would only appeal to Jews. I think right now that, you know, since you know, there's just a lot of story content, a lot of characters who are no longer just coded Jewish, but are stated to be Jewish. You know, one of the weirdest characters in that regard was this Moon Knight character, who, was created by a non-Jewish writer named Doug Mensch, and Don Perlin was the artist. I think Don was Jewish, but they made, it was very complicated. If you've seen the TV show, the complication comes from the comics, but he had four, he didn't just have a secret identity, he had four identities. And a father who was a Orthodox bordering on Hasidic rabbi. And so there's a story where Moon Knight literally knocks his father out in a boxing ring. It's a very strange story. So he's wrestling, with his Jewish identity, but one of his identities is as a mercenary. And so I remember thinking, Doug, I know you really meant well. I don't believe at all that you were at all prejudiced. I think just the opposite. You wanted to make Moon Knight Jewish so that there could be a Jewish identified superhero. But did you have to make him a guy who was a mercenary who'd do anything for money? It just seemed, that we're so at the mercy, even subconsciously, of all these cliches and these prejudicial images, you know. So there's I think there's probably more characters coded, and there's certain writers and artists who feel freedom, if they are Jewish, to have Jewish characters. It seems like in movies, that it's, you don't have to have a John Garfield anymore, where everybody knows that Garfield is Jewish, but with rare exceptions, he would just refer to himself as from New York. Hi, I'm on a Zoom call. Thank you. Okay. So that's, I think I meandered about 20 different subtopics,
Yeah.
but do you want to pick it up from
Well,
there?
what you were saying about Moon Knight is interesting, because the same thing happened when I started to hear about how Alexander Hamilton was very likely Jewish.
Uh-huh.
And there's a lot of research on that, if anyone's interested. But I thought to myself, man, why does it have to be the money guy?
Right.
It's that sort of thing.
I mean, I love Hamilton. Have you read the book that the show is based on?
I've not read that book.
His
I read
life story was so crazy, they had to
Yeah.
take stuff out to make the show believable, which I think is
Yeah.
amazing.
There
When
is a
he
book though,
arrived in New York,
the Jewish world of Alexander Hamilton. If
yeah,
anyone,
when he arrived in New York Bay, his ship was on fire and sinking, and he stood on the mast and just waited for it to come, just walked off. That was an amazing entrance. Um, being Jewish is complicated, obviously,
I
and
heard that. Yeah.
representing Judaism and Jewishness in it's complicated, and how that's represented today is complicated. I do think that the Jewish origins of the industry and the genre are very much forever part and parcel of these things. Again, it's a DNA thing. If there's Jewish metaphor in Superman, it's still there and it's always going to be there. If there's Jewish metaphor in Spider-Man and Captain America, it's always going to be there. It's in the DNA to one extent or another. But the industry itself is not Jewish. And actually, my view of it is that it's sort of it's not anti-Semitic, but it's certainly not simpatico to Jewish. As we said, they double down on LGBTQ representation, which is wonderful. But you're not going to see any positive portrayals of Jews in yarmulkes writ large. And there's definitely been tumbleweeds when it comes to the rise of anti-Semitism in the recent, years. So, representation is still tricky. And again, still Ashkenazis. Very few Jews are shown with pride and joy in their faith. The Moon Knight series is a good example. It was a Disney Plus show, and the Jews are all these kind of morose, morbid, sad looking, sepia colored. It doesn't make being Jewish look fun at all. So there's still a lot of that to contend with.
all right, I think we're probably out of time. Paul, you want to take us out?
Sure, thank you. Thank you both, Roy and Danny. This is fascinating. I loved the short film. I love what you guys do. I'm a comics fan. Thank you, Jonathan, for this issue of Humanistic Judaism Magazine. I think folks may notice that the last few issues of the magazine have really popped thanks to Jonathan's editorialship, and we're going to continue to cover topics that touch on Judaism. One thing we didn't really relate it to is humanism or secular Judaism, but as Jonathan mentioned at the beginning, so many of these creators were secular Jews, or certainly not religious, although religion has been portrayed in the comics at times. So if you're not already receiving our emails, please again sign up at shj.org, and we will do this again next quarter. But in the meantime, I wish everyone a happy Jewish New Year if you celebrate. And again, thank you, Danny and Roy. This was fascinating.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank
Take
you,
care,
everybody.
everybody.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Take care.